On September 11th of 2001, I had just started that year in September as a new librarian at Middleborough High School. So I had just started working there the previous week. And so I think we were into like a few days of school already.
So now we're in our first full week, and students are excited, teachers are excited, and that Tuesday was perfect. It was a day that the sky was so very blue, and there was a Christmas to the air, and it was gorgeous.
They will say that there'll be historical events that will take place in your life, and that you'll always remember exactly where you were at that particular moment. And I can tell you, I remember the actual, what I was doing. I remember the day, I remember the weather, I remember the smells, I remember everything about that moment.
There were certain times in history that you know where you were if you were old enough to realize what was going on. I was here in class in this very room, and we were doing a current events project. And all of a sudden, news flashes came across the news.
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
I remember a knock on the door. That was Mr. Brannigan, who was then just became department chair of the history department. And he called me out into the hallway, and he just said, "You know what, I'm listening to the radio while I'm doing work in my office, and I think we're under attack." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He says, and he started to explain how the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane.
I had heard that the World Trade Center was on fire. It was kind of at the beginning, it was like there was an accident. It was a fire or a plane hit it. And initially, nobody gave it a lot of thought.
And at the time, we didn't really understand the magnitude of it.
Yeah.
We just thought, some kind of an accident happened. Maybe, one of the small planes hit a building. So we knew about it, but we weren't really that scared yet because we didn't really understand what was going on.
Our computers had video cards on them, and we had TV on the computers, and we could actually watch the whole thing unfold at the time.
So I started watching what was happening with my class. I'm like, I went back in and I said, "I'm not sure what's going on, but something, terrible has happened, and let's see what happens next." So we began to watch, the events unfold.
We thought it was an accident. In all honesty, we didn't realize it was a jet airliner.
It was a very confusing time because nobody really knew what happened. We were really like, wow, what does that mean? Nobody really thought of the United States being under attack at that point. Then we started getting a couple of phone calls from parents. Are you going to shut school down? Are you sending the kids home?
I actually learned from a phone call. A parent had called and asked whether or not we were going to send the students home. So I was like, why would we send them home? And then they proceeded to tell us what had happened.
Parents were starting to call, but remember, the information coming out was different because kids didn't have a text that they could be getting a text from their parents.
The principal and assistant principal were in a meeting in the library, so I ran over to the library and kind of just said, "Can you come here?" So they came out, and I explained to them that we just had a parent who called and said that we had a terrorist attack.
I remember Mrs. Betancourt saying something to me about, there's another one.
Do you know if there were many people in the building?
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it? I can see it on this shot.
Oh my!
Something else has
You know what? We just saw a plane circling the building.
And then when the second plane hit, everybody knew it was a terrorist attack.
And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that Mrs. Miller, your teacher, she is from New York, and that she had family who was actually in the World Trade Center, or at least around it.
Paul Brannigan came to the door, and he asked to see us, and he said a plane hit the Twin Tower, but it wasn't just one, it was two. And he said to me that he knew that I had relatives in New York, and he said, "Sue, you might want to call home. You might want to see how everybody is." Well, I have just 4 cousins in this world 3 happened to be working in the Twin Towers at the time. And my uncle was a policeman in New York, and I thought, oh my God, this really can't be happening. So I tried to call, but all the lines were tied up. You couldn't get through to anything.
And I remember vividly watching the screen of the computer and seeing the building collapse. You see bodies that are coming off the sides of the building. It was the most startling thing that you would ever experience.
A lot of teachers were coming to the library because they knew I had a TV, and we were just in awe watching the TV, like just staring at it, and really not saying much, but just that we couldn't believe what was happening.
I was listening to teachers who were hurrying into the office area up on the 3rd floor, and they were turning on the television, and I went over and I saw the screen.
The faces of the staff that were in that room, and there was dismay, shock, tears, people saying, oh no, and they're looking at the TV.
When I turned it on, I was kind of alone in the room, and I saw the first building fall and crumble. I don't know if you've ever seen the videos of it, but it's like, wow, and the first building fell.
The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
That should be it.
It has completely collapsed.
It was just a deadening silence. I remember people not talking, but looking at the screen, and the emotion of shock is what I remember most, and being scared, very scared.
And then of course I saw all the smoke and the flames, and I think everybody was just flabbergasted. I didn't know how I felt right that instant because it was surreal.
First, I was incredulous, particularly when one of the other staff members said that one of the towers had collapsed. I simply couldn't comprehend that was possible, simply because a plane, no matter how big, had flown into the building.
Up until this time, we didn't have any type of protocol, no procedures in place to handle something like this as far as information to the kids, of a tragedy like that. So it was new to everybody. It was a shock to everybody.
So we started kind of strategizing. Nobody knew whether to tell the kids in the building or not. People were saying, well, don't tell the kids, but the kids already knew.
The school put in a policy was that they weren't going to tell us what happened. So at this point in time, we don't have smartphones yet. I didn't have access to a computer. So rumors were spreading about what actually happened. Someone told me that it was 4 or 5 planes. When I realized the actual truth that it was 2 big jets. We were a little scared because we didn't know if we were actually at war, what was going on. And again, I didn't have the access that we have now, so it was like just scary not knowing.
Yeah, just not knowing what was
because you
going on.
knew something happened.
We didn't have all the facts, we didn't have any real concrete information just other than the fact that these events occurred. And we didn't know how many students would be directly affected by it, so we didn't want to drop that information on them and then have somebody in a classroom like say, oh my gosh, my mom or dad or cousin, brother, sister, whatever, was on a flight today, and we didn't have any information for them at that point.
What do we do? How do we tell kids? Do we not tell the students? Could there be a parent of one of our students on one of those planes? And would we be notifying them in the wrong way? What kind of support would we be able to provide to students here? We weren't prepared. And what happens if we tell them and then we send them home and there's nobody home? All those things flash through your mind.
We had many phone calls who had asked us whether or not we were going to go home, what we were going to do with the students, and we told them that no, they're going to stay right here. We'll take care of them. If something occurs, we will certainly let you know as soon as possible.
Kids were scared. They really were. Even though they don't want to, admit it, but you just see two jet airliners, crash into the two most important buildings in the United States, other than Pentagon and the White House. You know something major is going on, and really we were at war. We were at war, not with a nation, but with a group.
And it seemed to be an attack on something, of course on the buildings, the people of New York, but at that point we had no idea that there was a greater scheme afoot and that the events of that morning would have such a great impact for the rest of human history. So it was terrifying. You have that deer in the headlights approach when you just don't know how to deal with something, but then you realize that you have to deal with it.
We made the decision we weren't going to say anything, but that was a hard decision because people were coming in from the outside. People had their computers on and their TVs on, and by lunchtime, students were beginning to get the message. Something was going on.
I do remember Mr. Brooks coming on or sending a message around saying, turn off the TV. You shouldn't be watching news in the class and let kids figure this out on their own with their families.
We were told at that time by a little secret messenger type of person that we weren't supposed to address this at all in our classes. So I finally learned from my students who happened to be seeing a TV, they were at the TV or something, but I couldn't say anything to anybody else.
It was just like almost a little bit of being surreal, that that some horrible thing has happened in the United States, yet you've got to go on with this, teaching the class, second conjugation of verb endings, which it was almost like, going through the motions.
We were trying to hold the lid on it. It wasn't working. People would ask us questions, we'd just say we didn't know. It was easier to say we didn't know because we weren't prepared to deal with the whole problem and what that whole problem was all about. And we felt it better that it was dealt with by families at home, where there was a support system that would be there through the evening hours and even into the next morning.
We were all told, we were given a note, that we were to say nothing. And actually, it was pretty easy to say nothing because we didn't know.
And the last line of the note said that at the dismissal bell, everybody is to go home. And everybody is to be with their family. And that the last line of it was just, be safe and God bless America.
And the rest of the day, we were all still in shock. I don't think we got too many studies done.
And holding the lid got tougher and tougher. I couldn't wait for dismissal. My thought was, we're ill-prepared to deal with it, we don't have a lot of information, and we need to get our students home and have them deal with those issues with their parents.
There was a lot going on in everybody's minds, and I think when school finally let out that day, I think everybody just wanted to go home and be safe, because you felt unsafe that day. You really felt like that we were under attack.
Well, my first feeling was, what next? And how big is this? How involved is this? It was shortly thereafter that we found out that a plane had already crashed, I found out, into the Pentagon. And that there was supposedly another flight in the air, and that subsequently crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. So that was 4 right there. There were 4 flights. We didn't know how many other flights were out there.
The idea that these planes had been hijacked and had essentially been used as weapons, it's difficult to prevent yourself from feeling even the most irrational fears, like how many other planes are there?
We didn't have all the information. They were talking about it was some sort of a terrorist attack. They didn't know. They didn't know they didn't know. One thing they did know was that the 2 planes came from Boston. And so that gets you thinking, first of all, that it's a local thing. There's local people on those planes, and how did all of this happen? Why did all of this happen?
First you're hearing that a small plane had hit one of the World Trade Center towers, and I'm like, well, that's shocking in itself. And then when they're saying that it's commercial airliners with hundreds of people on them, and knowing that there are tens of thousands of people who work in those buildings.
I feel like you didn't know when it was going to stop, and you didn't know how big it was going to get. If it was just a plane, or was it going to result in some kind of larger event, a war? You just felt like everything, you felt it start to crumble, and you weren't really sure.
and not knowing kind of amplified the anxiety and what everybody was feeling that day. So, I mean, when people say, you know, your head was spinning, our heads were spinning because we had a lot of questions with no answers, and you know, and we just feared for those who were in New York at Ground Zero, and of course the first responders who were going to be heading into God knows what. Just a lot of change that occurred very quickly.
So as you found out of the events and as they unfolded throughout the day, how did you feel?
Overwhelmed. Because it was so big, you know, it was just so bizarre, so unusual.
I felt an unbelievable sense of fear. Because once you realize that America was being attacked, it is the most unnerving feeling because we live in a country that doesn't happen to us.
My feelings, I remember, were centered around those people in that building, and I couldn't get my thoughts out of my head about seeing footage of people really having to jump out of buildings and the people trying to get down through them. I couldn't get away from the idea of what this had done to people and their families.
When our nation is under attack, and when we work in a school system, I think the most important thing is to make sure that our children are safe.
I think the biggest lesson is to remain calm, make sure you have all of your information and facts first, and remember that no matter what type of a disaster you face, that's partly what we're all here on this earth for, is to help each other out, and not just in the happy times, but in the difficult situations as well.
My grandfather used to tell me that nothing was carved in stone, and things change, and sometimes they change dramatically, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad.
The world has changed. You guys, you have not lived with pure freedoms that we had. You have lost some freedoms. I mean, even flying. You know, you got to take your shoes off. You can't carry certain types of things on the plane. Things have gotten really tight in the United States.
You guys are growing up in a world where you're used to the post 9/11 world and all of these security issues, but I grew up in a time where it wasn't that rigid.
We want to remain free, but we want to remain safe. So the people of the United States have to determine how far they have to go to altering the Constitution to be safe, and if they're willing to do that. That's one of the biggest problems that we have right now, is what are we willing to do to keep us safe, and is that going to violate people's rights? You know, common.
Nothing in the news the day before could have given anyone a hint that this was going to happen. But just be more knowledgeable. Never forget events like this, I guess, would be another piece of advice that I would impart.
It's important, and in subsequent emergencies that we've had around here, it's been apparent that kids often know more than we know right away because everybody's walking around with a computer in their pocket, and that we really can't keep information from kids, and that was a big thing. That, well, don't tell anybody, you know, we'll tell them just before they go home, or their parent, they can find out when they get home. But kids know, and nowadays kids know everything instantly, so that whole mindset that schools have had about keeping information from kids doesn't work anymore, because they usually know as much or more than we know, and then rumors get spread. So I think it's best to talk about the information as you know it, and keep everybody calm and understand that, you know, we're all going to work through whatever it is together that comes up, and we'll all be, you know, keep each other safe, and we'll work together. But to keep things from kids, especially high school kids, just doesn't work anymore.
Looking back on it all these number of years later, I would have very much liked to have been able to inform students a lot better. But the information we didn't have was really dictating that we couldn't share with them. We didn't know the conditions that they would be going home under. We didn't have enough information to really completely inform them. Yeah, I would have loved to have. I mean, as an educator, you want people to be up on their knowledge, But a difficulty was that we didn't have it all. We didn't have all the knowledge that we needed, and we didn't have the support system.
I will tell you the fallout for kids here was pretty significant. That Mr. Burke, who was a senior that year, his Florida trip, as I've taken seniors every year, was canceled. We were supposed to do an overseas trip to Spain and Morocco, and that trip got canceled. That there were bans placed all over the place in schools, that they weren't allowing kids to travel. So those were some of those fallouts that were really upsetting to me, because you look forward to your senior year of going to Florida. That's what we do, and that was a sad thing. And
Yeah, for a while there, they just canceled all field trips into Boston, and they canceled anything that had to do with any student travel was all canceled. They wouldn't allow it for quite a while after that, well over a year.
One thing that I thought was really neat that came out of it was the patriotism.
Yeah.
I had never really seen that at that point in my life. I was only 18 years old, and I'd never seen our nation really come together. And what I specifically remember is just driving through downtown Middleborough and seeing all those signs, like the C.F. Darcy sign or now the Boston Tavern.
Yeah.
And they all said, "United we stand." And everyone had an American flag out on the streets. And I just thought it was really, really neat that our country came together in a time of disaster, whereas I'd never seen that before. And I really never felt that strong sense of patriotism until after the events of 9/11.
I think the best advice is just to, remain true and loyal to your country. There was a lot of patriotism that began to be displayed after those events, and it was a shame that it took such an event for, citizens of the United States to be proud of their country. The number of people who had flags on their cars or in their yards or wearing pins or just being proud to be a U.S. citizen.
It's like the whole country changed that day. And, I think as Americans, it brought us all together. Where a lot of times when there isn't any major events, we kind of sway away from the patriotism. But at the end of the day, it really brought the good out in people.
Right after it, there was no politics. Everybody was together. It was a strong feeling that we all belonged together.
So the whole fabric of this nation was changed on that day. And I think us as Americans sticking together and working together is what we are really all about. And I think that's what America is about. And when tragic things like this happen, it really pulls this country together.